Hey, fifth grade, we are going to read our story for the week today. This is for lesson 21. We're on 21. It's our anchor text. It's called Tucket's Travels by Gary Paulson. Selection illustrated by Bill Farnsworth. And our author actually has written many more books than just this little snippet. This comes from Tucket's Travels, which is a series of books that he wrote, but he does write other things that you've probably heard before. Let's meet the author, Gary Paulson. Gary Paulson's characters often rely on wilderness survival skills to survive tough situations. Paulson sometimes recreates a scene, such as digging for water, in real life so that he can write about it from a first-hand perspective. That's cool. He actually he would dig for water himself so that he could write about how it actually feels and everything. So that's kind of neat. He has lived in many places, including the Alaskan wilderness and on a boat in California. All right. So today we're reading a historical fiction piece. It says historical fiction is a story set in the past. It may contain characters, places, and events that actually existed or happened. As you read, look for a setting that was a real time and place in the past, and then details that show how the story took place in the past. So as I'm reading, you're going to notice there might be some going back in time to remember something. So it could be a flashback, which is, when people think about what happened in their past. So this is called Tucket's Travels by Gary Paulson. If there was one thing that Francis Tucket knew, this with certainty, it was that death was close to taking them. I'm sorry, I'm going to start over. And first off, you're on page 636. So if you don't want to watch the video and the words, you can open your book, please, and follow along. So starting over, page 636, Tucket's Travels. If there was one thing Francis Tucket knew with certainty, it was that death was close to taking them. Dawn was coming, and here he was, a 15-year-old boy in charge of 2 children, walking across a sun-beaten, airless plain that seemed to be endless. Francis, Lottie, and Billy had no food or water or any immediate hope of getting any, and at any moment, a dozen or 2 of the dirt meanest men Francis had ever seen in a world full of mean men could come riding up on them, and he didn't finish the thought. There was no need. Besides, in surviving Indian fights, blizzards, battles, and thieves, he had learned that the primary rule about danger: it would come if it would come. You could try to be ready for it. You could plan on it. You could even expect it. But it would come when it wanted to come. Lottie and Billy understood this rule too. He had found them sitting in a wagon on the prairie all alone. Their father had died of cholera, and their wagon train had abandoned the family, afraid of disease. Lottie had been 9 then, and Billy 6. Francis hadn't thought he and the children would stay long together. After all, he had to keep searching for his own family. He'd been separated from them a year before, when Pawnees, which are Native Americans, had kidnapped him from the wagon train on the Oregon Trail. But Francis and Lottie and Billy, well, they were used to each other. They stuck together. Unlike Francis and Jason Grimes, the one-armed mountain man. Jason Grimes had rescued Francis from the Pawnees and taught him how to survive in the West on his own. Then they'd parted ways. Until last night. Last night, when Grimes had helped them to escape from the Comancheros. The Comancheros were an outlaw band, ruthless, terrifying, inhumanly tough. To escape, Grimes had to take the pack horses that Francis and Lottie and Billy had been riding and lead them off empty, hoping the Comancheros would follow his tracks westward while the 3 children headed north on foot in the dark of night. It was a decent plan, and it was their only plan, and it seemed to be working. As Francis and the 2 children had moved north in the dark, they had seen the Comancheros ride past them after Mr. Grimes, tracking the horses. The Comancheros had missed the footprints of the children, partly because it was hard to see them, and partly because Francis made Lottie and Billy walk in each other's footsteps. He came last, brushing out the trail with a piece of mesquite behind him. But luck was the major factor in the plan. If the Comancheros caught Grimes or even got within sight of him, they'd know that Francis and the children weren't with him. They'd turn and come back for the children. Children meant real money because they could be sold or traded into slavery. Francis knew that brushing out the tracks would only work in the pitch dark of night. In daylight, the brush marks themselves would be easy to follow. Page 638. I'm tired, Billy stopped suddenly. I think we've gone far enough. Francis frowned. When Francis had first met Billy, the boy wouldn't say a word, and now he'd gone from never talking at all to complaining. If they catch us, they'll skin you, warned Lottie. Now keep walking. If we don't keep moving, they'll be on us like dogs, won't they, Francis? On us, just like dogs. Lottie loved to talk, would talk all the time if she had the chance. Seemed to have been talking since Francis had found her in that wagon. Lottie would explain every little detail of every little part of every little thing she was talking about, so that not a single aspect of it was missed, and she sometimes drove Francis over the edge. Now, as Billy started moving again, Francis picked up the pace. He pushed them as hard as they could stand it, and then harder, and Lottie didn't have a breath left to speak. Dawn brought the sun, and the sun brought heat. Francis and the children were bareheaded, and the sun quickly went to work on them. Billy wanted to complain, especially as the morning progressed and there was no water, and the sun rose higher and became hotter. But Francis drove them until Billy began to weave. Then Francis picked Billy up and carried him piggyback, mile after mile, then yard after yard, and finally, step after step. So there they are, piggyback. Billy's piggyback on Francis, and then there's Lottie, the girl. Lottie saw it first. There, she said, see the spot? Francis was near dead with exhaustion. He had hardly slept at all for 2 nights before and had been used roughly by the Comancheros in the bargain. He was close to the breaking point as he said, what spot? There. No, more to the right, on the horizon. It's trees, I'm sure of it. A stand of trees. They had seen many mirages, images of trees and water that were not there, but Francis looked where she was pointing and saw it instantly. He stopped and set Billy down. The boy was asleep, and he collapsed in a heap, still sleeping. You're right, trees, and trees mean water. He turned and studied the horizon. He hadn't been able to look up when carrying Billy, and he was shocked now to see a plume of dust off to the west and south. It was at least 15 miles away against some hills in the distance. It was so far away that it seemed tiny, but Francis knew it was probably caused by riders, many riders. In 5th grade, if you look on page 641 in your own book too, as I move on to the next page, you can see that behind them, in the distance, you can see the dust in the air, which means someone's riding or something is coming. So they're a little worried that it's the Comancheros. They've figured out that the kids are going the opposite direction. So we'll see. Are they going to come get them? Let's find out. Lottie saw him staring. Could it be buffalo? She watched the dust. A small herd? Not here, Francis thought. Not here in the dust and heat with no grass and no water. Buffalo wouldn't be that stupid. Sure, it's buffalo. You're lying. I can tell when you're lying to me, Francis Tucket. It's them, isn't it? Francis said nothing, but his mind was racing. So the riders were heading back eastward. But why would they be coming back? Why would they be coming back so soon? Had they caught Grimes already? If so, they'd be looking for the children, or had they given up the chase or just seen Grimes and found that he was alone and turned back, still looking for the children? They might miss the tracks. He knew this was a vain hope. There hadn't been a breath of wind to blow the dust over the brush marks he'd left, and undoubtedly they had men who were good trackers, men who were alive because they could track mice over rocks. so the Comancheros would find them. And then, I think they're a little worried about the Comancheros. Here we go, page 642. He looked to the trees which were about 2 miles away. He could carry Billy there. They could get to the trees in time. Then what? The riders would keep coming back until they came to the place where Francis and the children had turned off, about 9 miles back. They would see the marks and turn and start north. 9 miles. The horses would be tired, but they would make 10 miles an hour. They had to ride maybe 20 miles back to the turn, and then 9 or 10 miles north after the children. He let the figures work through his tired brain. Maybe 4 hours, but more likely 3. The riders would be on them in 3 hours. Francis and Billy and Lottie would need an hour to make the trees, and then nothing. It would all just happen later. They'd get him and take the children, and nothing would have changed except that a few horses would be very tired, and Francis would be dead. And as for what would happen to Lottie and Billy, his heart grew cold. But there was something else back there, more than just the plume of dust. There was a cloud. At first it was low on the horizon and showed only as a gray line, so low that Francis almost didn't see it, but it was growing rapidly. The wind bringing it from the west, and as it grew and rose, he could see that it was the top edge of a thunderhead. It didn't look like salvation, not at first. He had seen plenty of prairie thunderheads, but as he watched it, he realized 2 things. 1, it was growing rapidly, roaring along on the high winds, coming toward them at a much faster rate than the horses of the Comancheros. And 2, it would bring rain. Rain that would ease their thirst and cool their burning bodies, and far more important, rain that would wipe out their tracks, erase everything they'd left behind them. Oh boy, guys and girls, so I stopped right here. So they're hoping this rain will wipe away their tracks so the Comancheros won't find them. So here we go. Still, it was a race and nothing was sure. The clouds had to keep coming to beat the horsemen to where the children's tracks turned north, and it had to rain. If the clouds turned off or didn't beat the Comancheros or didn't leave rain, then distance was all the children had. They needed to get to the trees and build some kind of defense. Francis picked up Billy, who was still sound asleep and seemed to weigh a ton. He set off at a shambling walk, abandoning the tedious brushing in their race to get to the trees. Lottie shuffled ahead, carrying Francis's bag. She was wearing a ragged shirt, so dirty it seemed to be made of earth. Her yellow hair was full of dust. Francis wore buckskins, but the children only had what was left of their original clothing and what they managed to pick up along the way. We're a sight, Francis thought. A ragtag mob of a sight. He looked at the trees, and they didn't seem any closer. He looked at the cloud, and it was still building, though it seemed to be heading off slightly to the south. He looked at the dust plume, and it was still moving on the same line eastward, getting ready to cross their trail. He looked back to the trees and thought, I would absolutely kill for that old mule that we had. But the mule had been taken by the Comancheros. Page 644. They reached the trees just as the edge of the clouds caught up with them. 10 more feet and I would have died, Lottie whispered and sank to the ground. Francis dropped Billy like a stone. The boy fell without awakening and studied their location. It was a meandering, dry stream bed with a row of stunted but leafy cottonwoods on each side. There were also stands of salt cedar, thick and green, while no water was evident. The stream bed seemed moist. Francis knew that there was water beneath the surface, or the trees would have been dead. Lottie, scoop a hole there, at the base of that rock. You want to start digging? Why don't you just go ahead? I have more important things to do than scrape at the old ground. Water, Francis was so dry he croaked. Dig down and let it seep in. Oh, well, why didn't you say so? Lottie knelt by the rock and started digging in the loose sand with her hands. When she was down 2 feet, she yelped, Here it is, just like you said, coming in from the sides. Oh, Francis, it's so clear. Come see. She scooped some up and drank it. Sweet as sugar. Come try it. Francis knelt and cupped his hands and drank, and thought that he never tasted anything so good. But he stopped before he was full. The wind was picking up now, blowing hard enough to lift the dust, and even sand, and he could no longer see the dust from the riders. The wind was blowing at the coming thunderheads, and he smiled, because even if it didn't rain, there was a good chance the wind would fill in and destroy their tracks. But now the thunderhead was over them, dark, so huge it covered the whole sky, and the wind had increased to a scream. Ooh. "Over here," Frances yelled to Lottie, "beneath this ledge." Incredibly, Billy was still asleep. Frances grabbed the boy and shook him until his eyes opened. "Get over by that rock ledge. Everything is going to break loose." A bolt of lightning hit so close, Frances felt it ripple his hair. So close, the thunder seemed to happen in the same split instant. And with it, the sky opened, and the water fell on them so hard it almost drove Frances to his knees. He had never seen such rain. There seemed to be no space between the drops. It roared down, poured down in sheets, in buckets. Frances couldn't yell, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. He held Billy by the shirt and dragged him beneath the ledge that formed on the edge of the stream bed, away from the trees and out of the wind. Lottie was there already, and they huddled under the overhang just as the clouds cracked again, and hail the size of Frances's fist pounded down. One hailstone glanced off the side of his head and nearly knocked him out. So there's the ledge. You can see that they're sitting underneath to kind of give protection. But Frances is the one that's a little on the outside edge, so he's still getting hit by the stuff. "Move in more," he yelled over the roar of the storm. "Farther back, move!" He pushed against Billy, who slammed into Lottie. They were already up against the clay bank beneath the ledge and could not go further in. Frances's legs and rear were still out in the hail and took a fearful beating. He doubled his legs up, but even so, the pain was excruciating. And though the large hailstones quickly gave way to smaller ones, his legs were immediately stiff and sore. The stream bed filled in the heavy downpour. Luckily, they were near the upstream portion of the storm and so avoided the possibility of a flash flood, which would have gouged them out of the overhang and taken them downstream to drown. As it was, the water came into the pocket beneath them and turned the dirt to mud, and soon they were sitting in a waist-deep hole of thick mud and water. And just as soon, in minutes, the rain had stopped, the clouds had scudded away, and the sun was out, cooking the mud dry. Page 649. Aching, Frances pulled himself into the sun. The children crawled after. Water still ran in the stream bed, but was receding quickly. The hot sun felt good, and Frances wanted to take his buckskin shirt off to hang. But he knew that if he didn't keep wearing it, the shirt would dry as stiff as a board. He straightened slowly, working the pain out of his legs. He looked to the west and smiled. There would be no tracks after that. And here's the final picture over here that after the storm, the kids get out, and you can kind of get a good feeling. You can kind of see what's in their minds after that story. All right, so guys and girls, this historical fiction story, it's about Frances, Lottie, and Billy. So what I'd like you to do, if you could please, thank you for listening, and go back on Google Classroom and answer the question. And the question is, what does it mean to have good instincts? And an instinct is like, how you react to something that's happening, So like, these guys had to have good instincts while they're traveling and trying to get away from the Comancheros and the rainstorm. So what does it mean to have good instincts? All right. I look forward to seeing your answers. See you soon. Bye.